with the Bolshevik Revolution. And it was very important for them. And this is a very well documented story. But then let us look at how subversive they become. And they are ostracized, penalized, victimized by this is the power of the Stalinist regime. So even as they were campaigners, they were active supporters. This is where cinema as a creative expression, cinema as it looks for a creative idiom, also runs into deep trouble with the establishment. Battleship Potemkin and October, two of Eisenstein's films, out and out propagandist, and Eisenstein did nothing to hide it. He believed in what he called agitation propaganda. This is one ideology of cinema, political cinema. But then Eisenstein was also very creative. He was also looking for a creative dimension. And it is here that when the creative dimension, when the aesthetic dimension far exceeds one's own ideological position, that it runs into deep trouble. Beshin Meadow is one. 1937, Ivan the Terrible. And these got him into very, very great trouble with Stalin. Because these films, such films, had nothing to do with the declared Stalinist ideology. And therefore, for Stalin, these were reactionary, not actually grounded in the kind of socialist realism he believed in. What I'm trying to say is, even if you're a propagandist, a declared propagandist at one level, when you let your creative aesthetic impulses take over, go beyond your ideological position, this is where creativity, experience runs into trouble. And this I regard as the ethical political position. In fact, he turned to anthropology, turned to the primeval sources. He turned into what we could call the origin of things. He made a film on Mexico, Viva Mexico. Nothing to do with socialism, nothing to do with communism, with Bolshevism, with Bolshevik thought. But to look at a culture, an ancient culture like Mexico or Aztec or whatever, he made Viva Mexico. Not political, not ideological, but shall we say a creative anthropological entry, exploration of the Mexican culture. Stalin would have none of it. And we must remember that Eisenstein couldn't make films for several years. This I regard as a cultural trait of cinema. This I regard as an essential. The political is embedded in the culture, and out of the political we must extricate cultural dimensions. Let's turn to another master, the Ukrainian master, Alexander Dovzhenko. He made Aerograd, Scars, Arsenal, again a believer in the Bolshevik Revolution. But Dovzhenko made these are actually magnificent landscapes. Made a film called Earth. A bit of background here. This was the period when Stalin believed that there should be collectivization of farming, that there should be no individual ownership, no individual cultivation. Dovzhenko subscribed to that, but when he made Earth, this is the ecology, the ecological aesthetic of Dovzhenko. He began looking into the primordial, primeval feelings, human connections with Earth, and Earth as feminine, opposing the masculine, masculinity. In a way, the gender question comes into being. Not to mechanize, not to lose contact, one's ontological relationship with Earth. Stalin would have none of this. So your cultural idiom, your aesthetic idiom becomes a very important political tool, a political instrument, which gets you into trouble with a monolithic political establishment. So we can't separate, in these masters, we can't separate the cultural from the religious, from the philosophical, from the aesthetic, from the political. And therefore, it's so wrong to regard them as very separate, exclusive categories, as if the aesthetic is not political, as if political does not have aesthetics, as culture is apolitical. Now, these are all fallacies, and that's what I'm trying to show here. Now, Earth, Dausenko's Earth had a very cosmic vision of the primordial relationship. This had nothing to do with collectivization of farming. And it was the relationship between the human self, human being, and the existence of the earth, that you must respect earth as a mother, that you must have that sense of reverence. Not progressive enough for Stalin. This was retrograde, reactionary, and certainly not progressive enough to build a socialist state. And so Dausenko's film has nothing to do with the social realism. In fact, the Stalinists, the authorities attacked Dausenko for making blasphemous, reactionary, retrograde films. The point that I'm trying to make is that the political state, whatever its ideology is, I'm now talking of the Stalinist ideology, it assumes the form of a monolith. Now, this is cinema's relationship with culture. This is cinema's relationship with the culture of politics, the politics of culture. This monolithic state suppresses a dissent, would not have anything of dissent. And therefore, in this sense, it's also the cinematic tradition's confrontation with nationalism of whatever kind. And therefore, nationalism becomes central. So a very different kind of an aesthetic expression also becomes a very important political, gains a very important political dimension. Let me turn to Pulovkin. I'm not talking of the Soviet filmmakers as if it's a single Soviet tradition, but they're different ones. In fact, they come from Armenia, they come from Azerbaijan. I'm using it, as I mentioned earlier, only for the sake of some clarity and convenience. In fact, Pulovkin became overtly political in some of his films. But then look at how a certain technique can create a political dimension that is unacceptable to a Leviathan state. This is a technology at work. Technology is not a simple, mindless, routine technical skill in cinema. Pulovkin, Eisenstein had done it, but Pulovkin expanded on Eisenstein's theory and practice of montage. Now, montage is not just mere editing. It's something like an architecture. It's architectonics that you create an architecture. And what Pulovkin did was, from realism outside, shall we say, external reality, he said, I must also capture the inner world of human beings, the consciousness of human beings, how human beings think, how human beings feel, and you cannot condition human emotions, human feelings. So it also became necessary, the journey from the outside world, because this is also an internal world, and the internal world is as real as the external world. So your politics, your revolution is, if it is one part of history, dealing with human emotions, dealing with human feelings, human consciousness, trying to understand it, is also a reality of its own. And again, the Stalinist authorities found it again very, very easy for them to use words like regressive, reactionary, and they don't support the cause of the revolution. They don't further it. he was, therefore, what happened was Pudovkin was compelled, no choices in a fascist state, in a dictatorial state. And we know the stories of Soviet Russia under Stalin with Beria, his secret service agent. People would disappear overnight. Not unfamiliar to us these days in India. In fact, he was compelled to make state dictated documentaries, films, and he had to obey, either obey or perish, be exterminated. These films, Mother, Storm over Asia in the Days of Struggle, all these in the 1920s, mid 1920s, the conflict between cinema, this is the registration of the fact that we must register the fact that cinema is a free exploration of form. The formal features of cinema, formalism as it gains a political dimension, and the control exercised over it. Now, again, shows how the political, the experiential, and the epistemological principles come to clash with each other. I will end my reference to the Soviet masters with reference to Zido Vertov. In fact, Vertov came up with this theory of cinema verite. Verite, being truthful, capture. The documentary form comes into existence. Go out with a camera and capture reality as it is. No dramatization, because Vertov believed that if you dramatize, over dramatize, you dull. You just take away the sharp consciousness of the proletariat. So you have to capture reality without a melodrama, without exaggerating emotions, but only by being strict and true to the documentary form, that it has to be a documentation. Just two films of his, three songs about Lenin and the man with a movie camera. But this again, so these filmmakers show us that when formal structures, aesthetic structures, go beyond the rigid reductionist framework of political ideology, when a political ideology is tempered with new aesthetic principles, then begins the conflict. Very important for us because we have doctored films, very well supported by the state. This is also the relationship between the ruling state, the temper of the ruling state, and filmmakers. You can refer to all the files that have been made, from Tashkent to Kerala stories and others. And let me turn to the story of pure within quotation marks. There's nothing that's pure. Of two great filmmakers. We cannot even classify them as Soviet filmmakers. In fact, the very last film that Tarkovsky made was shot in Sweden, The Sacrifice. These were unbearable for the Stalinist regime because they were purely metaphorical, so figurative. But you must realize that the poetic, that the metaphorical is not without its roots in history. It's not without being located in historical structures and historical realities. Andrei Tarkovsky and Sergei Parashinov, especially if you watch Parashinov, is the color of pomegranates. You can't make out what it's all about. Today there was talk of the word being central, the meaning gets postponed, the innumerable, infinite levels of meaning. There are cinematic images which make no sense at all, even if you watch them understand. Because there's no meaning, just fixed it. So fluid, so beautiful. Just watch, available, The Color of Pomegranates by Sergei Parashinov. And Tarkovsky's films. Let me tell you, the metaphorical dimension of sacrifice, the sense of ethics that Tarkovsky carried. The other films are Solaris, The Stalker, but I will only talk of The Sacrifice. sheer poetry at one level, but if you look into the content of that poetic practice, there is this man, insane, idiotic. Those who want to save the world, humanity, civilization are all idiotic and stupid at one level because it's impossible. He says, I'm prepared to make a sacrifice of myself if the world wars, if pain, if cruelty, bloodshed can be stopped. So let's ask the question, where do poetic metaphors come from? Where do cinematic metaphors come from? Do they exist in an ethereal realm which has no connection with the lived experiences of human beings, with the experiences of those who are suffering, who are marginalized, oppressed? Which is why in his important book, Sculpting in Time, Tarkovsky said, there's nothing like poetic realism as pure imagination, as pure metaphor, unless it has its grounding in concrete historical, social, political reality. And it's a long story when you think of how Tarkovsky was driven out, exiled, and the kind of religiosity, if you look at the other films of Tarkovsky, Andrei Rublev, Mirror, well, I'm not going to go into the details. You will see that it's also important for Tarkovsky to attack the religious institution, decadent religious institution. So religion as it becomes ossified, religion as it becomes miserably dysfunctional, you lose the sense of the spiritual. What is the sense of the spiritual? I will come to that a little later because we again believe that spirituality is something that comes to us, drops down from the heavens, and comes to us as a benediction of pseudo godmen and decadent religious institutions. But the point is, the spiritual is when you make sacrifices to save fellow human beings to begin with, or your community, or your society, or you stand up against a nation, or you stand up against the fascist tendencies of the entire world. If there is anything spiritual, that spiritual has to be located in your ethical practices. So we'll also have to interrogate what we mean when we drop this word spiritual. We do it in a very loose manner, amorphous manner. There is no spirituality without your sacrifice to save whatever you feel compelled to save. And what was Parajanov trying to do? Again, look at the politics of his cinema, The Color of Pomegranates. He didn't want a monolithic Soviet consciousness if there ever was one. So Parajanov brings into his film, he blends his Armenian roots, the Armenian, the Ukrainian, with Azerbaijan, with the glorious principles of Christianity through the Gospels, not through any church. And the Persian poet, Sayatanova. Now, this is an integration. This is to go beyond when we talk of the regional, when we talk of the specific, when we talk of the particular. Does the particular, does the specific exist in an ahistorical state? Does it not become inclusive of, does it not embrace other traditions, other forms of consciousness, and other ways of living? So if there is an Armenian tradition to Parashino, you can't even understand the Armenian as excluded from that it exists in its own spatio-temporal realm, because blends with the Azerbaijan, blends with the Christian mystical tradition, not the Christian institutionalized church, and the Persian imagination to a both side note. This is why it's important for us to recognize that when we talk of confluence, it's not even a confluence. In fact, one grows out of the other, one influences, borrows, transforms. Whatever cinema borrows or whatever literature borrows is always in a state of transformation, and we must look at these transformative possibilities. If this is one kind of a trajectory, let me briefly draw your attention to East European cinema, which is very different from the so-called Soviet cinema. And I only mentioned two or three Hungarian filmmakers and one Polish filmmaker because it's a whole area. Let me turn to the Hungarian filmmaker Miklas Ksou. Brilliant allegories, amazing allegories, but these allegorical narratives of Ksou were conscious of the historical fact that there were two enemies to Hungarian culture, to Hungarian experience. One was the deadly attacks on Hungarians, Hungarian cultures by the Hungarian Communist Party. In fact, one of the great essays we should all read with great benefit is an essay by the philosopher Michael Polanyi, who writes a very old essay, but still very relevant, the message of the Hungarian Revolution. That the party becomes more important than the people, that the Politburo becomes more important than the people. So, in pure poetic, allegorical, symbolic form, Ksou creates his narratives. And it's very wonderful to watch these allegorical creations. I've just mentioned three or four. The roundup, the red and the white, and the red psalm, made in 65, 67, 71, coinciding with aligning with the Hungarian Revolution. How then do we look at allegory in cinema? How then do we look at the metaphorical, the poetic realism in cinema? Is it devoid of, is it empty of strong historical, political meaning associations? The other one, of course, is again a staunch critic of the Hungarian, the Soviet, and the capitalist model, the living legend Bela Dar. In fact, we should only watch carefully, given our situation today, just two films, Turin Horse and Satan Tango. But let me tell you a story which shows how complex this relationship is. And I will give you the example of only one director. So this is only to show how today's global capital and how state power can transform the ethical, the creative principles of an individual. How difficult it is for very sensitive individuals to escape a story of state power, state intervention, state hegemony, and the subtle manipulations of global capital. The example I give you is of the Hungarian filmmaker again, István Szabó. I'll give you two films as examples. One is Mephisto. In Mephisto, Szabó talks of how an artist can be trapped by having proximity to, by being close to the Nazi masters, the ruling masters. Mephisto is a story of an actor who rises higher and higher and higher, and in the end to discover that he's trapped, that his aesthetic freedom, artistic freedom is controlled by the Nazi master. It is to show the very complex, unnecessary, very dangerous relationship between art, any form of art, and the fascist powers that rule. If this is Szabó taking on fascism as a creative artist, now look at the tragic story of Szabó. Zabo made another film, and you will see that Mephisto, Zabo, tragically, ironically becomes the Mephisto, and he's trapped. Zabo made another film called Taking Sides. Taking Sides is a biographical film on one of the greatest conductors of Western classical music, Wilhelm Furtwängler. This is a film financed by Western capital, Hollywood entry. And in this, Zabo, the man who questioned Nazis, distorts history under pressure, distorts history and makes Fort Wrangler look like a Nazi. But I have accounts of Fort Wrangler. I've gone through the biographies of Fort Wrangler, Wilhelm Fort Wrangler, the man who tried his best to save as many Jews as possible. The man, in fact, it's available, you can watch it. He's conducting Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. 1942, the World War is taking place on Hitler's birthday with the Berlin Symphonic Orchestra. Fort Wrangler is conducting Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. All the Nazi generals are there. Fort Wrangler refuses to give the Nazis salute. He was into deep trouble because he did not fully support the Nazis and did his best to save the Jews. Why then? Look at the problem that we need to ask. Why then that this Zabo converts Fort Wrangler into a Jew painter? What are the compulsions? So his creativity, his cinema, is a film director really beyond politics, political compulsions? Or is he also compelled to, forced to act as an agent of the state? I raise these questions only because we have entered more treacherous times these days. And this is why when I turn to Andre Vajda, the Polish filmmaker, it's the deadly combination of the Russians attacking Poland and the Germans attacking Poland. In his 90th year, this is painting creativity, the idiom of creative expression, and the ethics of political commitment. In his 90th year, the last film that Vajda made called After Image, through a Polish painter who refuses to bend, to submit himself to the will of the Stalinists, Vajda makes a strong political statement against how Poland, which was raped by both the Germans and the Russians, now has to stand up and fight for its sovereignty. There are hundreds of such examples, but the point I'm trying to make is when we look at crucial phases of this cinematic tradition, when we look at the crucial phases of the history of cinema, we notice that filmmakers, exceptional filmmakers, break new forms, try to create new idioms, new modes of expression, because it's also an ethical compulsion for them to stand up for, to fight for what they believe are very, very fundamental democratic values and principles. This was true of the French New Wave, the Italian Neorealists, but this is not all about external realities. We also look at the other trajectory of cinema, and I just mentioned a couple of films here and stop there. Alain René, the left bank French New Wave, he makes two films, among others, Hiroshima Mon Amour, and the other film is Last Year at the Marienbad. Now, this is the other exploration of cinema. You can talk of the world outside, you can talk of the terror outside, and Mussolini, Hitler, General Franco in Spain, put them all together, the reign of fascism all over Europe. But then what does it do? What do these rules do, fascist rules to do to human beings? What happens to the consciousness of human beings so they enter the inner worlds without psychologizing? The fragmentation of the human self, the split personality, if there is a split, not in psychological terms, but in terms of what a trauma, terror they undergo, they have experienced. So last year at Marimba, what is memory? What is imagination? What is human consciousness? How does human consciousness function? Where do we have to look into it? And how do you deal with splintered selves, with the dichotomous selves, with the divided self of human beings? The other kind of realism that comes into cinema, cinema history, cinema tradition, is to look into the inner world, the consciousness of human beings, which is what Bergman tried to do. The Swedish filmmaker in Wild Strawberries, Silence, Persona. But then, what is the other important trajectory for me when I turn to the so-called confluence of cinema, literature, and culture? Let me turn to other stories. I've dealt mostly with the Western European traditions, but let me turn to other traditions. I'll give just two examples in the form of, because these are very important dimensions when we talk of any kind of confluence. We can't disregard them. I'll talk of just Kenji Mizoguchi, the Japanese filmmaker, and Akira Kurosawa. Kenji Mizoguchi's outstanding, remarkable film called Sancho the Bailiff, and of course Kurosawa's Rashomon. We know what violence, what terror, what pain Japan inflicted on other nations. If you look at Korea, the Koreans hate Japan even to this day. Monstrous, barbaric, they were worse than savages. How does cinema try to find some kind of an alternative, some kind of a healing, redemption, when you look at having gone through all these enormous oppressive tendencies of your own times of the past? This is where the other dimension comes into being. In Sancho the Bailiff and Rashomon, not at all surprising that Japanese cinema, with all other influences, turns to the sacred through the Buddha, the Buddhist tradition, the image of the Buddha, the practice of Buddha, the practice of Buddhism. And therefore, to say that Japan has to heal himself, the world, if it needs to heal itself, one of the alternatives, if not the only alternative, this is Mizoguchi and Kurosawa, is to embrace ahimsa. The only path left for us, if we are to seek any kind of salvation or redemption, is through the Buddhism. The Buddha figures in various ways. The icon of the Buddha in Mizoguchi and, and in Kurosawa's Rashomon. It's not at all surprising that Japan produced two outstanding filmmakers who had to look at, to go beyond the cruelty of modern Japan, to go beyond the cruelty of medieval Japan, because they were all stories filled with all kinds of horror stories, and the oppression of women. The way Japanese women were treated, were used even during the Second World War to act as slaves, mistresses, to act as sleeping companions, to offer sexual comfort to Japanese soldiers. All these are being treated. So I say this is also the gender question that figures in very important ways. Eventually, how then does one think of saving the world at all from scientific disasters? If science has brought progress, it can be as disastrous as political dictatorship. How do we save the fate of this world, what we call Anthropocene, the destruction of nature? Not just our expression today, the climate change or the struggle for the climate. Mizoguchi and Kurosawa turn to these things. I will mention only one film called Darsu Uzala. Darsu Uzala by Kurosawa, to embrace this earth, to embrace this cosmos in a spirit of rejuvenation, to rejuvenate oneself, to rejuvenate the cosmos, the earth. The earth is fundamental, nature is fundamental. As Stanley Kubrick tried to do it in 2001 A Space Odyssey. The monstrosity of science and technology, what we regard as the threat through artificial intelligence that you are overtaken by. That's why it's a futurist film, 2001 A Space Odyssey, as Tarkovsky did, working with a science fiction writer. If you watch Solaris, if you have political hegemony, if you have destruction caused by politics, one of the most important principles of progress is science and technology that can also cause great havoc. This is the cosmos of cinema. And where do we look for sources of redemption? This is again very important for me, and I assume for all of us. Where do we look for sources of redemption, salvation? No Messiah is going to come. No Messiah is going to come through the holy books. And therefore, we must catch a sense of the sacred. This is culture, the culture of cinema, the politics of cinema, the vision of cinema. You must look for ordinary people, despicable as far as others are concerned, destitute, unknown people. And this is the great French filmmaker Robert Bresson in Mouchette and in Balthazar. Balthazar is the story of the donkey. Jesus and the donkey. Simple people, ordinary people, destitutes, they are the healers of this. So don't look for those with arms, those with bows and arrows. Perhaps our cultural equivalent would be, don't look for Kodandarama, look for Sita Rama. Not the bow and arrow, not the weaponization of the human mind. And this, the other great film I would suggest, if you haven't watched, is Pasolini's film, The Gospel According to Saint Matthew. When I talk of these films, all that I'm trying to say is that the cinematic tradition addresses the political through these cultural metaphors, through these cultural allegories, which is also the manner in which Aravindan, I'm not talking of any particular tradition when I talk of Malayalam cinema, when I talk of other kinds of cinema, I'm not saying this is Malayalam cinema, this is Tamil cinema, or whatever. Aravindan tried to do the contest, the stereotypes of the standardized Ramayana by creating the tribal Ramayana in Kanchana Sita. And you watch his Estappan. Now it's somebody regarded as mad, insane, but he is the Christ-like figure for us to save us from our own violent selves. This was what Bresson did in again that remarkable film Nazarene. So go through the entire trajectory of cinema, you will see that filmmakers, not just literary figures who are out to save this world, they are not the only saviors. There's a serious engagement of very, very profound filmmakers with very important cultural, political, ethical questions. And that's why you see when you turn to John Abraham, Agrahara Tilkaide, Amma Aryan, I can give you hundreds of such films from the Indian context. They were struggling because it's a different story when you think of the fall, the collapse, and the decadence of the Communist Party in West Bengal in Kerala. So moving from one tradition to another, moving from one language to another, moving from one cinematic territory to another, because I'm only interested in talking of how cinema has had a very fundamental central preoccupation with very important political ethical questions. I end by drawing attention to some magnificent young filmmakers of India doing remarkable work who will not figure, who will not get theaters for screening, who will perhaps get 20 20 or 30 lakhs, not 300, 400 crores, and who will never be supported by the state. I'll just give you the list. And again, dealing with the communal question, with the political question in India, all of them are between 35 and 40. Fahim Irshad. And I've just mentioned the films, I can't go on in great detail. Ani Mani, Uttar Pradesh, through a Muslim family talking of the cult of violence against Muslims. Ksou, another filmmaker, Ksou, Isegi, because how it is Isegi. And a remarkable filmmaker, young filmmaker, who made films, docudrama films like Vertov on Kashmir, Prabhas Chandra. The title of the film is I Am Not the River Jhelum. And from Northeast, wonderful films from the Northeast dealing with the plight of the Northeast, facing the centrality of our political regime. The Nelly story, Humans in the Loop, and Joseph's Son. Now, these are filmmakers who are in the periphery, who are confined to the periphery, but who take on the might of those at the center. So, which for us is the periphery? Which is valuable for us? Those working at the periphery are those in the mainstream who dominate us, control us, and who use their hegemonic powers. So, can we subvert the center? Can we subvert the centrality of powerful structures through those working in the margins? The stories of tribals, the stories of people who have always been kept outside this mainstream of history, so-called mainstream of history. And it's to the credit of young filmmakers, and of course, Ananda Patwardhan making all kinds of documentaries for decades. This for me represents the culture of cinema, where cinema finds its confluence, not just with literature or with culture. Cinema creates a culture which perhaps is very important for us. If it is not, should become important for us if we think not just of the future of cinema, because how can these films ever even dream of taking on the might of the Karodpatis and the sway of those mythologies? My question, I end it as a question, a rhetorical question perhaps. Where is the future of cinema? What is the future of cinema? And what is the future of that kind of cinema which has central problems of civilization at its heart? How then do we tackle the crises of history, our history, through these poetic, metaphorical, allegorical, realistic endeavors of very, very enlightened young filmmakers in particular? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Manu Chakrabarty, for a very fascinating presentation. I'm sure each one of you here will agree with my remark. And for the benefit of the audience, again, I have a quick recap of what Professor Manu has talked about in his paper. He interestingly begins with a caveat. He's talking about not giving an overarching view of what cinema does, but he focuses and draws our attention more to how his paper will be of a predominantly, he will be engaging with the text, that is the textual engagement. Then he talks about the ethical dimension of cinema. Then he also sensitizes us to the world of cinema, and especially the world political, and how he highlights that the word political is actually looked at as politics, and it should not be. It is more of a enlarged vision of life. He wants us to look at the word politics as an all-encompassing thing. Then he raises crucial questions about the issue of ethics vis-a-vis cinema. Then he also draws our attention to the internal contestations of movies that are produced all over the world. And finally, he also talks about how the destinies of individuals and communities are very crucial to the cinema. Uh, he focuses more on the Western in the initial part of his paper, then the Asian, especially with reference to Soviet filmmakers, and then he highlights how cinema can be used as a site of contestation. He also draws our attention to the distortion of history and how makers use mythology and how they historicize it. There are instances where he talks about how mythology is used to align with fascist tendencies too. Then he gives the example of Eisenstein, then focuses on the anthropological and primeval aspects through that movie, Viva Mexico. Then he draws our attention to the political uh, and the cultural and how we have to extract the cultural from the political aspect. So then he also talks about the scientific disasters. And once we have this political disaster, we turn to the towards the world of science, and science also brings in disasters. And then he gives movies how film producers have negotiated this, and how politics and science are both, very harmful to the human society, and how the filmmakers, through their movies, give a very cosmic vision, and where to find the healing for the suffering human world. That is the question with which he engages in the later half of his paper. Then he concludes his paper by highlighting the contributions of young filmmakers, and leaves the paper open by asking a question of how these movies are of our youngsters in India. They are blurring the boundaries of center and periphery, and where to look for the center. Is it possible for the periphery to blur the center or occupy the center? And one of the crucial questions which movies can provide us is to engage with how one can, come to terms with crisis in history vis-a-vis the human history. Now I throw this paper open for discussion. You can make your questions, you can shoot your questions rather to Professor Manu. If you have any observations to make, please make it very brief. If you have any queries, you can always ask Professor Manu. Now the paper is open for discussion. Thank you. We have about 20 minutes, Shika? Yeah. This is 10 to 4. We'll wind up by 4:10. Yeah. 20 minutes for discussion.
Number for some, that we holding number also. Yeah,
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, sir. Very happy to see you. It's okay, sir. Sorry.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's okay. I'm not questioning anything. I'm just asking some information. Please spell few words on duplicate and duality, split personality, unknown, and what is representing exactly for the society. I'm asking about duality, sir. Duality, duplicate, and split personality. I have heard regarding this idea. Means what is the differentiation and how it is effect for the society? It's not question, sir. It's just
Let's see if this answers your question. I made it clear that the word split, double self, divided self, in fact, they do not refer to a clinical state of the human being. I also said, if I remember, that it's not psychoanalysis. This is not abnormal psychology. I said the attempt is to see how, if there are problems, psychological problems, not of a clinical kind, these problems of certain tremors, of certain dislocation within, is because of the world outside. So if you look at a psychological condition, psychological state, the problem is not with the one who you think has a psychological problem. The problem is with history, problem with the community, problem with the state, whatever it is that induces uncertainty, tension, anxiety in individuals. So if you look at human beings who are not, within quotation marks, normal, if you call them abnormal, you will have to locate abnormality, the not normal, in the not normal conditions of society. So this is not to say that there is a clinical pathological condition in the human being, but it only reflects the social malaise, social disease, social irregularity. I hope it answers your.
lot of representing the on topic, using the double body.
Maybe you should just walk down and talk to him.
Nowadays we are seeing the almost representing the same organization of the double body. And for example, if you look back 1960 to 1981, especially in the Kannada movie, the Kinari and the Bharat all those things are representing the moral, ethical example. But nowadays it's shifting the psychological and very interesting and sadly different.
What is it that you want?
ಫ್ರೆಂಡ್ಲಿ ಆಗಿ ಇನ್ನೊಬ್ಬ ಯಾರೋ ಒಂದು ಬೋರ್ಡ್ ಭಾಳ ಫ್ರೆಂಡ್ಲಿ ಬಟ್ ಇವಾಗ ಏನಾಗ್ತಿದೆ ಅದನ್ನ ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತ ತೋರಿಸ್ತಿದೆ ನಾವು ಮೈಕಲ್ ನೋಡ್ಬೋದು how body will affect after sir has explained that it
ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಚಿಕ್ಕ ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಡಬೇಕು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ನೀವು ಬಾಡಿ ಆಫ್ ಸ್ಟಡೀಸ್ ಇನ್ ಸೈಕಾಲಜಿ ನೋಡಿದ್ರೆ ಒಂದು ರಿಮಾರ್ಕಬಲ್ ಸ್ಕೂಲ್ ಹುಟ್ಕೋತು 70s ಅಲ್ಲಿ, ದಿ ಆಂಟಿ ಸೈಕಿಯಾಟ್ರಿ ಸ್ಕೂಲ್ ಅಂತ. ಅದರ ಮುಖ್ಯ ಪ್ರವರ್ತಕರಲ್ಲಿ ಒಬ್ಬರು R.D. ಡಿವೈಡೆಡ್ ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ಈ ತರ ಪುಸ್ತಕ ಬರ್ತಿರೋರು. ಅವ್ರು ಹೇಳೋದು ಏನು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ಅವಾಗ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಟರ್ಮ್ ಹುಟ್ಕೊಟ್ಟು, ನೀವು ಯಾವ್ದನ್ನ ಕಾಯಿಲೆ ಅಂತೀರೋ, ಮಾನಸಿಕ ಅಸ್ವಸ್ಥತೆ ಅಂತೀರೋ, ರೋಗ ಅಂತೀರೋ, ಎರಡು ತರದಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡ್ಬೇಕು. ಅದು ಸಮಾಜದಲ್ಲಿ ಇರುವ ಒಂದು ಕಾಯಿಲೆ, ರೋಗ. ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಇದನ್ನ ಆಲ್ಟರ್ಡ್ ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಕಾನ್ಶಿಯಸ್ನೆಸ್, ಬದಲಾದ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಜ್ಞೆಯ ಒಂದು ರೂಪ ಅಂತ ನೋಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ. ಇಫ್ ಯು ಲುಕ್ ಅಟ್ R.D. remarkable inquiry into the human head. In fact, they were all anti-psychiatry. So, ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಸೈಕಾಲಜಿ ಎಂಬ ವಿಷಯದ ಒಂದು ಸಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟ್ ಫೀಲ್ಡ್ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಕ್ಷೇತ್ರ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಅದರೊಳಗೆ ಬೇರೆ ರೀತಿಯಾದಂಥ ಚಿಂತನೆಗಳು ನಡೀತಾ ಇದೆ. ಅವರು ಕಾಯಿಲೆ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಒಪ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಲ್ಲ, ಮೆಂಟಲ್ ಇಲ್ನೆಸ್ ಅಂತ ಒಪ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಲ್ಲ. ಮೆಂಟಲ್ ಇಲ್ನೆಸ್ ನಾವು ಮಾನಸಿಕ ಕಾಯಿಲೆ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಮೆಟಫರ್ ಆಗಿ ನೋಡಿ, ಯಾವುದರ ರೂಪಕ್ಕಾದ್ರು ಮೆಟಫರು, ಯಾವುದರ ಪ್ರತಿಮೆ ಅದು ಸಮಾಜದ ಕಾಯಿಲೆ, ನಾಗರಿಕತೆಯ ಒಂದು ಅಸ್ವಸ್ಥತೆಯನ್ನು ಬಿಂಬಿಸೋದು ಇದು. ಸೊ ಇಫ್ ಯು ಲುಕ್ ಅಟ್ somebody who is not normal, mad, insane, that's actually a projection, a reflection of the madness, sickness of the society. ಬೇರೆ ಚಿತ್ರಗಳು ಹೇಗೆ ತೋರಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಅದು ಹೇಗೆ ಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ತೋರಿಸ್ಬೋದು, ನಾವು ಏನ್ ಮಾಡೋದು. ಬಟ್ ಕೆಲವು ಸತಿ ಹುಚ್ಚು ಅನ್ನೋದು ಕೂಡ ಪಾಪ್ಯುಲರ್ ಚಿತ್ರದಲ್ಲೇ ಕೂಡ. ಇವಾಗ ನೀವು ಬಲೆ ಹುಚ್ಚ ನೋಡಿದ್ರೆ, ಆ ಹುಚ್ಚ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಅದು ಈ ಹ್ಯಾಮ್ಲೆಟ್ ಮಾಡುವ ಆಕ್ಟ್, ಆಂಟಿಕ್ ಡಿಸ್ಪೊಸಿಷನ್ ಅಂತ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಕ್ಲಾಡಿಯಸ್ ಹೇಳ್ತಾನೆ, ಗ್ರೇಟ್ ಮ್ಯಾಡ್ನೆಸ್ ಇನ್ ಗ್ರೇಟ್ ಮೆನ್ ಶುಡ್ ನಾಟ್ ಅನ್ವಾಚ್ಡ್ ಗೋ ಅಂತ. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ನಿಜವಾದ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಅರ್ಥದಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿಯ ಕಾಯಿಲೆ, ಮಾನಸಿಕ ಕಾಯಿಲೆ ಅನ್ನೋದು, ಮೆಂಟಲ್ ಇಲ್ನೆಸ್ ಅನ್ನೋದು, ಯು ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಟು ಸೀ ಇಟ್ ಆಸ್ ಎ ಮೆಟಫರ್ ಫಾರ್ ದಿ ಇಲ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಎ ಸಿವಿಲೈಸೇಷನ್, ಆಫ್ ಎ ಸೋಷಿಯಲ್ ಆರ್ಡರ್. ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಪಾಪ್ಯುಲರ್ ಸಿನಿಮಾ ಬಂದಿತ್ತು 4 months, ಒನ್ ಫ್ಲೂ ಓವರ್ ದಿ ಕಕ್ಕೂಸ್ ನೆಸ್ಟ್ ಅಂತ. ಸೊ ಈ ತರದ ಬೇಕಾದಷ್ಟು ಪ್ರಯತ್ನಗಳು ನಡೆದಿದೆ. ಇವಾಗ ಎಸ್ತಪ್ಪನ್ ಅಂತಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ನಾಜರೀನ್ ಅಂತಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಕಲ್ಲು ಹೊಡಿತಾರೆ, ಇದು ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ, ಹುಚ್ಚಂತರ. ಬಟ್ ಅವನು ಒಂದು ಸಂತನ ತರ, ದಿ ಸೇಂಟ್ ಆಸ್ ಎ ಮ್ಯಾಡ್ ಮ್ಯಾನ್, ದಿ ಸೇಂಟ್ ಸೀನ್ ಆಸ್ ಎನ್ ಇನ್ಸೇನ್ ಫಿಗರ್. ಇದು ಅಬ್ನಾರ್ಮಲ್ ಸೈಕಾಲಜಿ, ಸೈಕೋ ಅನಾಲಿಸಿಸ್, ರಿಡಕ್ಷನಿಸ್ಟ್ ಸೈಕೋ ಅನಾಲಿಸಿಸ್ ವಿಷಯ ಅಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ನಾನು ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ.
Good afternoon, sir. First, I want to thank you for this wonderful your reflection on multiple this tradition of cinema and conflict experience involved in politics. Sir, you reflected on Andre Tarkov's case film and I think culture, poetry, and all this. So I want to relate to two directors film, and I want to ask him to make a question. Andre Tarkov's case film, many films, his cinema film, cinema poetry, and here Carlo Barcelona's cinema di poesia, and he quoted it's called the gospel according to.
I mentioned
Matthew, yes, El Winkler second Matthew, and this is
the gospel according to Saint Matthew.
yeah, but Matthew, not Saint Matthew.
Saint Matthew.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah. So how do you see their sacredness and their, because both one is Catholic Marxist and other is religion, I mean spiritual practitioner. There is under Tarkov's religion, they are religious. But under Barcelona is Catholic Marxist. So how do you see? I mean, how do you say that they are religiosity and the cinema poetry or cinema poetry? And just one thing I want to ask more. How do you say that if I see the Nobel Prize winner, Lazarus, they try to again establish the power of art. If I see the power of this, if I try to interpret this thing in cinema as the question also future of cinema. So how do you see this future of cinema from your point of view? I mean, how do you see that? Sir, is it clear? My question, I think.
No, my answer is I think I ended by saying the future of cinema. I made two statements. We must look at the future of cinema from the questions that those working in the periphery ask, not those at the center, not those who are part of what we could generally call the mainstream. That's why I gave you a whole list of people who are working in the margins, the periphery. So that's why I use the word, if you subvert the dominant trends, the dominant patterns, the modes of subversion come to us from those who interrogate, who question standard stereotypes, the dominant paradigms. So I said it's the time, perhaps the future of cinema as I see it comes through those forces of subversion, subverting ideas of nation, nationalism, the standardized forms of religion, the standard forms of global capital, all forms of subversion that come to us from these interrogators. I think that's the future of cinema. And if you ask me a question, is there a future? I have at least 15 filmmakers from India itself. So I look at the alternatives that have already come to us. And all these young filmmakers, in fact, they made their first films 10, 12 years ago. Not many talk about it, not many know about it.
Okay, thank you. So, cinema is poetry and poetry cinema. Will you distinguish?
No, but will you please be specific with your question? Can you reframe your sentence?
Yes, I'm very personally cinema is poetry. And personally, under the is cinema poetry. So, how do you see?
Uh, Let me return the question to you. Do you think there's a fundamental difference? No, because I want to answer, but are you trying to say that a distinction has to be made between the two? If so, what is the distinction you would make? Because I still don't get your question. What are you trying to say with the example of Pasolini and Tarkovsky? What is your position so I can answer your question?
Yeah, one is Marxist. I'm telling, I mean, Catholic, they still Marxist, but he trying to find out sacredness in the through this film and this film itself. They try to sacred, they try to show the try to in secular world how they are showing through this film the theological cinema.
My simple answer would be if you watch the text, whatever their declared ideology is, my specific answer is you watch their cinematic text, all your labels, all your ideological labels come to nothing if you look at the cinematic text because you see a certain historical, spiritual, religious transcendence.
Okay.
It's like I give you the example of Eisenstein, a declared agitprop filmmaker, but when he changes his form, aesthetic modes of expression, each individual goes beyond herself or himself as a creative artist. So it's also the structure, the nature of the idiom you use. Battleship Potemkin is very different from the other films. In a single filmmaker, you're talking of two filmmakers, I say, even in a single filmmaker, you will not see the same pattern, you will not see the same preoccupation.
Just an observation. What I have seen is, recent years, most of these artistic movies,
No, we are able to hear you.
most of these artistic movies are choosing this OTT platform to showcase that means to exhibit their cinema. They are preferring this OTT platform. They don't have this theaters like the commercial movies. So in that case, even there is a section of the category of audience or viewers who prefer to choose such movies watching in OTT platform, theater rather than watching movies in such multiplex theaters. Uh, what exactly is the reason for uh, the audience, sorry, the distributors of commercial movies going for multiplex, and what exactly is the reason for artistic movies uh, if- choosing the OTT platform?
Even that's not Shrikant very true. For example, if you look at a filmmaker, I just left him out, I have left out almost 30% of all that I had to say. Somebody like Devashish Makija. I mentioned two films of his, Old Sledge and Zoran. If you look at that, Zoran was released in the theaters. 3 days, 4 days, and if you think the OTT, your Netflix or whatever, welcomes these filmmakers with open arms, even that's a fantasy. It is not true. So much so, uh, Devashish Makija said, very sincerely and truthfully, I can't even pay my rent. In fact, this is the huge sweep of money, power, global capital. Some good films in Kannada. I don't know how many of you have heard of. Very, very well done, lovely film. Mithya. Mithya with a young child protagonist. Film of remarkable insight. Nowhere. Or another, what we could perhaps call, whatever your expression is, middle cinema, middle cinema. And the title itself says, it is for everybody. The title of the film is Sakutumba Sameta. Come with your family. Unheard of. 2 days, 3 days, three shows, they vanish. This is the power of capital. We had Mr. Kansara in the morning. Not against it.
Intelligent audience, they are choosing.
I'm not even talking of intelligent, dumb, and stupid. I don't believe in value judgments. But I'm only talking of the power of the capitalist institution. Can I talk of at least 10 films, if you have to use your categories, commercial, sensible, lovely commercial films, not your art house cinema, which did not run for more than 2 or 3 days, and with 10 people or 15 people. In fact, I will ask the question, why is it that a fairly sensible commercial film, very political, Puneet Rajkumar, his own fans didn't like it, Prithvi, when Yadurappa was chief minister, when the Reddy gang, mining gang was around, a family, Rajkumar family to make a film like Prithvi was not at all easy. Taking the mining barons, deep political film. Why did it not run? Why did the followers of Puni say he should not have done this film? Whereas Shivraj Arsu and all that, they run. How do we explain this? I'm not interested in making value judgments, but these are the tendencies of art. Prithvi was a flop, a total failure. Why? So we have to try to understand these contradictions, these dualities. And the best example of a very serious filmmaker is uh, uh, this Devashish Makija. And I didn't talk much about Telugu cinema before because if I go on and on and on and on, Telugu cinema has a very strong political tradition. In fact, Mrunal Sen came back and did Vokabudi Katha. Gautam Ghosh came and did Mahabhumi. And 2 or 3 years ago, Rana Daggubati and who is that sensible actress made Viratapalli on the rise of the People's War Group. Viratapalli. Who is that Telugu actress? Very sensible, who got into trouble by making same statements. Saipal. Saipal. It has a strong tradition. Our films in our Indian languages have a strong political shift. I don't know how many watch Virat, and very sensitively done. Another film, Kanjarapadam, very extremely better, low key, low profile. So there are any number of examples I could give, but the only answer I have, Shrikant, is to say, so then we must make a different intervention. To the extent we are allowed, it's possible for us to make interventions.
Well, if there are no questions, I thank the audience for a wonderful interaction. And I also thank the Department of English, Karnataka State Open University, and the Open University for giving me an opportunity to chair this session. And it's a privilege to chair a session where you have a speaker like a very distinguished scholar, and a senior teacher and an academician who is still a very serious student of literature, Professor Manoj Chakravarti. It was wonderful listening to you, sir. Thank you so much.
I knew that once he allotted this hour for Manu Chakravarti sir, that it won't be boring for the audience. I knew it very well, and he lived up to our expectations. Thank you very much, sir, for accepting our invitation and coming over here and addressing all of us for 1.5 hours, almost 1.5 hours. I call upon the stage Mr. Professor Madhava sir to come upon the stage, please, sir, please, to felicitate Manu Chakravarti sir. Please come upon.
I acted in 2 films and I produced 1 film after mortgaging my house for 40 lakhs. It did not run even for half an hour in any one of the Mysore films. I have acted in another film, even major roles. That also, probably because of my face. That also. I have great pleasure in honoring a well-wisher of mine.
Going back to the 1983s or early 1980s, I must share 1 or 2 things about my well-wisher, Professor Manoj Chakravarti. He was a research scholar then. I was in my first year MA and second year MA. Somehow he had developed a liking for me because, probably because he had seen me only in a pajama and a shirt for 2 long years. Apart from my 99 rupees Bata chappals, I didn't have another pair of shoes or chappals or whatever. Probably those days. And he used to come with his, shaking his pocket like this. Mogu, ಇವತ್ತು ದುಡ್ಡೇ ಇಲ್ಲ ಕಣ ನನ್ನ ಹತ್ರ, ಬರೀ ಒಂದು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಕಾಯಿನ್ಸ್ ಇದೆ, ಅದರಲ್ಲೇ ಕಾಫಿ ಕುಡಿಯೋಣ ಬರ್ತೀಯ ಅಂತ. ಯು ವುಡ್ ಗೆಟ್ ಮಿ ಟೀ ಅಂಡ್ ದೆನ್ ಯು ವುಡ್ ಆಪ್ಟ್ ಫಾರ್ ರಸಮ್. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಯು ವುಡ್ ಆಲ್ಸೋ get me 1 or 2 cigarettes. And that's the way he looked after me during my college days, MA days. And I'm very happy that I got an opportunity like this to honor my great well-wisher, Manu Chakravarti. That was provided to me by KSOU. And he lost his mother very recently, some 2 years back. She was a great mother. and she was very fond of me, and I must have eaten from her hand at least some 20, 30 times. They lived in Saraswatipur. These are some of the memories. I have written about him in one of the essays, which is going to be published sometime in next month. Thank you very much. Thank you, Srikant, for offering me this opportunity of felicitating one of the close. Thank you. I call upon Professor Meena Pillai to come on the stage to felicitate Professor Vijay Shishar. Meena, madam, please.
For our 35 years of association, Meena and I both started our PhD together and we are about to retire.
Thank you, madam. It's so nice of you. Uh, Thank you, sir, for chairing the session. And in the next 1.5 hours, we will be having Professor Srinivas from Azim Premji University, who is going to deliver the plenary talk. And for that session, our own colleague, my own colleague and head of the department, journalism, Professor Shailesh Rajas will be chairing the session. I call upon Professor from Azim Premji University to come on the dais, please. Come on the stage, ma'am. Today we have Professor Srinivas. Srinivas S.P. Professor, School of Liberal Studies, Azim Premji University, Bangalore. Actually, Professor Dattatreya gave you a number and I contacted you. And thank you for accepting the invitation, sir. And thank you for coming all the way from Bangalore today. And now you will be delivering a talk or a speech on emotions in cinema and literature. Emotions in cinema and literature. On which, again, it's a PPT presentation. Sorry. It's a human cells topic. The topic on which Professor Srinivas SP is going to speak on is digital terms, the decline of viewership and readership. I repeat, digital terms, the decline of viewership and readership.
Many thanks to the Open University for inviting me. Uh, I'm going to speak with the assumption that I'm largely talking to a group of seekers of English literature, language and literature. So I have organized my presentation around questions of text and textuality, and I'm grateful to Professor Manu Chakravarti for opening up the topic, the theme for us. I will be talking not so much about specific films and filmmakers, but the kind of texts that we are all immersed in today. So, sorry. Yeah, the digital is not turning. Sorry. So here's my question. I'll start with the question, which I'm sure all of you are asking in the class and context. The context, we all know that it's a digital and we are immersed in digital technologies. What implications do these technologies and things have? That's the question that I'm asking us. And basically, the main place that it's a hypothesis that they impact many practices and also they have worked over the time over the last few years, last 2 decades to take stock of the kind of methods that we adopt, we use for our own analysis and also the methods that we teach our students, the capacity and the capability that we build or acquire and also build in our students. Okay? Now, the title is a little misleading. Please why misleading. I'm not actually saying that there is a kind of worship, but I'm saying the misleading. Now, let's step back a little bit to the case that we're all familiar with or most of us are familiar with, which is the statement from the method of judgment on Perumal Murugan's one part. Here the text saying to the opponents of the book, those who study the vaccine and nothing there is sentiments, knowledge, who don't like the book further. But you know that it's not as simple as that. You can't throw away as easily as white people tell us to. The story is following. The book was around 2010, it was published 2014, it was translated into English. In the meanwhile, a lot of people have written about it. Most of them were very, what should I say, people who were largely appreciated. There were also some critical comments and so on. English translation was received well, and around the time that the English translation came out, what happened is that suddenly the text acquires a new life. Okay? Now, anyone is familiar with essay, and if wish essay text in the class. I think now the question we ask, about 50 years after studying English is who's reading what and how? Right? Who's reading text? What kind of text? Of course, it's a whole problem in literary theory, but who's reading text and how is it reading text? So here's the journey of the text. Now, there is protest. The protest
was accompanied by the circulation of photocopies of certain pages, excerpts of the novel. Alright? They were circulated to the scene, they were circulated during rallies, they were read out in public meetings, and they were, seen as real seen, therefore the need to buy the book should be banned. Now, there were, the agitation was becoming, was threatening to be violent, and there was a secular made a statement which was posted on Facebook by a friend. Okay, so in his, so what happened suddenly is that the excerpt plus Facebook post in the name of the author saying that Perumal Burger, the High Court was dead. And then there was the High Court judgment, and the High Court judgment basically said among other things that the book should not be banned. And what do we have now? So you have multiple texts coming into play, and then you have readers, presumably readers who read quietly the Tamil version and quietly the English translation. Critics, of course, were saying who were reviewing the text and so on. There was translator involved, there were multiple translators, there were agitated members of castes or political parties, caste groups of political parties, and then there was the text. So this many categories of readers came into play, and also notice that the text is not the same thing. The Tamil version is not the same as the translation, is not the same as the excerpt, is not the same as the author's intervention in the middle of all of this. Right? Now, one of the languages that we now hear is that the public doesn't read. Okay, we have a public that's not a reading public, it's a social media public, it's a public that's easily excited and gets close to violence. So I'm putting a question mark against that. Is it the case that the public doesn't read? Or is the public reading differently? And therefore the need for us to rethink what we mean by reading and what we mean by text. So let me propose that what is on the decline is not actual readers, but a figure. Okay? Should I say in the classical terms, a construct. Alright? Something in our heads, something that we have all collectively built, and it is a figure of a certain kind of reader which we look back almost nostalgically towards which was serious reader, the sad, the red carefully, and then they engage in quiet and reasoned debate. Now this is the stuff of mythology, we know that this figure comes from 18th century Europe, or at least what was supposedly the public in the 18th century Europe, the Western European country. Now, this figure of the individual who reads alone, who reads silently, paying close attention to details, in the history of all human civilizations, is a very decent figure. Alright? And it also perhaps a figure that never really existed on the scale that we imagine the figure to be. Okay? And I'm saying that that is a figure that is now very much under the eye. That figure is being threatened in very real terms. And people who try to approximate, real people who try to approximate to the figure are also being threatened with these things. And I'm suggesting now that this is a good time, high time that we reconceptualize readers as people like us, living entities, as well as reading. Now, I want to basically video and ask what whether it is relevant to us. Okay, there's no one. Yes, thanks. Yeah, yes. Okay. Right. Yeah, that's pretty much place to start. So, is this of any relevance to us? Any responses? I'm going to start pointing my hand at you. Yeah. We recognize where this, what film this is in the context of. Kantara chapter 1. Okay, this is one of those things that became very viral because of the kind of performance that was put up by someone who was coming out of the theater. Do watch the film, it is quite dramatic and quite fascinating. Now, why is it relevant to us? Is it because it's Kantara, the biggest piece in Kannada cinema history supposedly, or at least the biggest recently? Is that the reason? No, definitely not. here is basically the kind of problem that, or the kind of challenge that today's digital technologies and our facility are the ease with which we, the ease with which we are, using digital technologies, immersing ourselves in digital technologies for this work. You notice at the beginning of the clip, this man comes out with a mobile phone camera focused on himself. Alright, so he is doing some kind of a trance, but the trance is very much a film in the making for someone. We don't know where that film went or that video went. What we're seeing is other people watching him make a video of himself doing the trance. Right? So that is the kind of loop that we are now in. With consumers of films coming out, becoming producers of videos who are also becoming performers for other people to watch, enjoy, and also translate and broadcast. Yeah, next please. Yeah. So what we have, stepping back a little bit, go back to the 90s. Since then, we've had a rapid expansion of the scope of our discipline, basically English, studying, whatever you want to call it, both in teaching and research. Okay, when I did my master's back in the 20th century, the most up-to-date course we had was a course on Commonwealth literature, which had text in the 1980s. Most other syllabi were basically either American, one paper in American literature, but mostly British literature, and of course, like everybody else, like all good universities, Hyderabad University, English literature syllabus stopped with the modern, which was decades 84. That was the last text. Now, subsequently, if you look at the Hyderabad University syllabus today, we have a number of papers, elective papers on cultural studies, film studies, working languages, and so on and so forth. So, as far as thinking is concerned, the scope of what we do is very, very vast. As far as research is concerned, very few of our students are in fact working on English literature or American literature. In fact, not too many people, maybe not even the majority, are working on multiple texts. They're working on films, they're working on television serials, they're working on all kinds of popular cultural forms. So that's why I say it's called creativity. Yeah. Okay. More? Just one second. So what we're going to have to meanwhile is that people who are trained in English departments have moved on in the permanently while doing the English department work. And we have the teacher student now, she gets the film studies department. I've dabbled in cultural studies and film studies and back to literature, media studies less frequently, but this is where we are. We need people who are trained in this, this is where we tend to be, this is where we're going. So what is it that next? So what has allowed English literature students to do this? How is it that we have moved across so many disciplines? How come we are present in larger numbers than let's say historians, film studies and cultural studies? How come we are present in larger numbers than say political science, sociology, and psychology? All these are disciplines that we draw very, very regularly. So why English and why not these disciplines as the backbones of say film and cultural studies? Yeah. I think the answer is because English literature is dangerous to read, and this competence is what we are taking to other domains, other kind of textualities that we are now engaged with. Other disciplines also learn to read. Also versus only. Our primary job is to read, okay, and teach our students to read. And what we mean by reading is, of course, to be closely to be able to interpret text, to be able to be sensitive to actual nuances and forms. And when we do that badly, we are not doing our jobs well. We are doing as students of literature, as teachers of literature. And evidence is, unfortunately, embarrassingly all around us. Next, please. Right. Just a disclaimer here for the purposes of today's presentation, I also think viewing is a form of reading. Some of you may visit the images, but let's just think about this as a form of engaging with text, as a form also of watching. watching closely and integrating it. Next. Now, the evidence. From first year BA students writing essays to PhD students to articles of PhD thesis and articles of where the manuscripts were clear that I now get to read once in a while. What is it that I find? Basically, plot summary is offered as analysis. It's a more familiar problem. I'm sure all of us do it, but we're not sure about our own work. There is a repetition of what is already widely known. We all know popular culture is economic, it's sexist, it's casteist, it's elitist, and then exactly what we will say at the end of the day. What is the point? Okay? And worse, if it comes at the end of the plot summary of, say, a dozen novels or something. Yeah. So basically, it's about reading. Okay, let's not lose sight of the fact that reading is what we do and we should do it like next, please. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying let's go back to this. Let's go to the text. But basically, the essential skill is reading. And today, as we all agree, what we mean by reading is related to forms, textual cues. Intextualization is a term I'm borrowing from anthropology, which in fact stole it from us, stole the idea from us, but basically it means the objectification of discourse, basically putting something up from life or from utterance and making it an object of study. Right? Intextualization. Well, you can extend that to say that when someone writes a novel about the Congo country, like everyone has, he has indulged in the form of he has performed a form of intextualization. He has made a slice of life into an object that he can study. So objectification here, I don't mean in the negative sense at all. I just mean into making an object of study, an object of analysis, which is, of course, removed from the original form. If I write about my mother, then obviously by my very act of writing is taking that story away from the context in which it unfolded and bringing it here so that we can all reflect on it, all criticize the kind of person my mother was, or appreciate the kind of person my mother was. Okay? Sorry, what is the last one? Yeah. Yeah, and then contextualization is something we all understand. Basic text and context. Yeah. Yeah. What do we know, students? Now, when increasingly with long text, a novel is a torture instrument now as far as students are concerned. The bigger the novel, the more complex the novel, the more it is. Please forget about it. Nobody reads, over the history of even Ramayana, Mahabharata, translation. ChatGPT is the main help for our students and us. Not real problems. I studied at Delhi University in the 1980s, and every single course, every single paper, 3 papers that we have on the language, every single paper could be easily passed. And also, if you are diligent enough with your guidebooks, you could easily get first class or at least a high second class by without reading a single text. It's possible, long tradition, established tradition. But now, ChatGPT has made this even more acute and even easier for us to get past this obstacle of the text. We don't have to read anymore. Nobody needs to read it. Okay, so next. So at the same time, okay, more young people are capable of reading today than ever before. And I'm saying this, in universal time, never before in the history of humankind have such a large section of any given population be able to read. In India, youth literacy rate is 90% plus, it's 92% or something. Fantastic. Yeah, and it's much higher in some other places. Even social media, if you look at all the time, you want some amount of reading and writing. When we're texting, we're writing. Yeah. And then there is reading class. There are blogs. There are also people who painstakingly reduce every stuff and long writers, 1,000 words, 290 words and so on. So people are reading, people are actively reading. They're not just consuming, but they're writing about it, they're responding to it, and they're broadcasting their love and hate for text. Yeah. An example of reading class. This is apparently India's largest. I don't know how you read that much of this, but I'm told that it's a very large book club, thousands of members. Yeah. Yeah, and this is the Discord, reading servers. There are hundreds of them with thousands and thousands and thousands of members. Right? So people are logging on and reading, okay, and they're writing about what they read. Next. And then you have people who part in the reading, right? So people are reading, they're reading complex texts, they're reading novels, and they're talking about them. So there's almost that, what can almost say nostalgic for the certain idea, the figure, the reader in our head, who I just started by saying, will no longer around or may not be there in such large numbers as we thought, is actually there. Now, what's happening here, however, when you go into a Discord server or when you go into a common reading club, is that your reading is being mediated by, of course, modern technology, but by various other factors. So, mediation of reading is again an issue. I don't want to go back to, I want to say within, context because we all there are romantics, we all there are open, Johnson and all that. The 18th century has a period of essayist and critics. So one can always say that that's when reading, mediation of reading becomes a part of what we do as readers, right? And then you have the romantics who begin to be deeply suspicious of critics. We also know from our decade, waiting for forward, that the worst kind of abuse that you can hurt somebody is critic. Once you call somebody a critic, that's it, end discussion. Yeah. So what social media platforms are doing is that there's a proliferation of the errors for mediation, and it is also digitally enabled because it is digital accessibility. And these are also determining how we read and what we want. Yeah. So there is also the mediatization of text. You will notice that I'm speaking in terms that are familiar with people of media studies, and not very familiar with the media studies. The larger point, which I was not able here, but the larger point I take is that we can't really separate these disciplines anymore. We have to learn from other disciplines, but also figure out where we are intersecting with other disciplines and their concerns. Mediatization is the mediation of all spheres of life and mass media, which is to say social media, and so on. And interactivity is a key part of this process of mediatization. What interactive mass media does is to create, encourage insight, demonstrated and performative actions. It is not my genius at all, it's not my observation, this is a long-term research process. Among others, Ksou and others in 2010, already 15-year-old study, pointing out that basically what social media does is it promotes self-expression rather than dialogue, and it encourages the performative kind of interaction. Yeah. And active viewing, if you want to think of that, in cultural studies, the big break was, the big development we always thought that it is possible to open up the cultural studies with the recognition that the readers are active, viewers are active, they are not passive viewers. They engage actively with what they say, what they read. And of course, this is not quite what they might have meant. We've had a long history of active viewing here in Karnataka, but also in other parts of India, where we have had dancers who constantly engage with the image, but perhaps doing things with it that we may not approve, or that we might find shocking or wasteful. That's a he can be found around this particular shrine, or he could be. I don't see it very much anymore. But this is the Jetinagar shrine, which is right next to a monthly mall. So the spaces are also interesting. On the one hand, it's having regular space, and then there is this, Bhuvaneshwari, and then Vishnuvardhan, and then this man who dresses up as Vishnuvardhan, and he moves around there and meets people. Yeah. So this is also, of course, not what we meant when we say active viewing. There is trolling as a form of engagement with the visual, and engagement also with not just the visual, but those who are engaging with the visual. So you say something I don't like about a film or an actor I like, then I'm going to attack you. I'm going to join up with my friends, with members of my political party, or other such formations that I'm going to target. I'm going to make sure that it's not. Okay? And we know that this is highly sexist, it targets minorities, there are all kinds of issues with I'm not doing all of that. But surely this is not what cultural studies scholars in the 90s and the late 80s meant when they said active viewing is something that we need to pay attention to. Or this is not what they mean by active viewing or something that they said. So today what's happening with active viewing? So I'm going to show you some examples of active viewing. Okay.
where you clearly see that the act of viewing has been contextualized, it's been objectified. More. Okay, so spectatorship itself has become a text. Okay? Spectatorship that has become the, basically it's recorded, it's translated, and also a source of education. Yeah. Now, I want us to just very quickly look at the genre for the reaction video. It's one of those completely, what shall I say, fascinating, but what we feel is okay. Okay. So it's just a fascinating movement genre. Also, something that we, I think, should not start paying attention, not just reaction video, but genres of this kind. This big A React is one of the popular, not the most popular. After all, it only has some between 300,000 followers, which is nothing for YouTube. YouTube, if you really big, will cross the 1 billion mark. This is not there yet. So these are Europeans reacting to all kinds of things. And interestingly, they of late, or they have over the last few years been reacting to a number of Indian texts, including I'm going to give you an example of the reaction to the climax of the first Kanda. The particular comment, not chapter 1, but the earlier Kanda. But first, let's meet the group. This is a sample of the kind of videos they have. Yeah. Yeah. So look at the number of times that they have looked at, I think you can see Banan somewhere, the speech or some of the reaction to music, cartoons, food, and so on. Yeah. Yeah. Let's watch this. This is how a typical reaction video like this. It's a family of 4, and they just sit around and react, and they find completely inane comments on what's unfolding before them, and hundreds of thousands of people are watching these. Sometimes their reading is completely off the mark. They don't understand what the hell is happening, but they still comment, and that is something that people like us are watching by the 100,000. Yes. So that's usually what they have, the picture in picture format is what they have. You can see different pictures there.
Guys, we just reacted into the awesome trailer for Katara. And in this video, we will watch and react to the climax scene from this movie. The climax scene is one of the most requested videos on our channel ever. And yes, we do read all your comments. So we are very excited about this. So let's just go. The climax scene from Katara.
But just before we begin, if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, now's the time to do it. Come on, babies, join the Big family.
Yeah, that's right. So, no more talk. Let's go. The climax scene from Canada.
So, I will pause this in a second, but you get a sense of what kind of a video this is, what kind of a genre this is, right? Yeah.
Sure.
Wait for viewership.
Sorry?
Did you wait for viewership?
Yeah. They must be making money on this.
Yeah, they get money.
Yes. Yeah. So what we have in our context today is a proliferation of what is known as the creator response video, okay? Creator reaction, creator response video, and these are by now about 15 to 17 years old. I mean, this is that they started around that time. started around the time when YouTube started becoming widely available to Indians. Okay? And other places, but it's been initially it was largely an Indian phenomenon, at least the kind of video that we are familiar with, that people are screaming short videos of screens. Okay? This in turn is traceable to fan celebrations in cinema halls. Those of us who watch films in, say, in the district area in Bangalore or maybe other parts of South India, I'm sure it happens in Mysore as well. Where this, fans come in the first few days or the first week or so, then they put into the screen, they whistle, they cheer, they do all kinds of things. But interesting thing is that a lot of this was happening from the 1970s and 80s, and there was very little evidence of it happening. This is very little recording of it, very little photographs, and people just spoke about it or people simply experienced it. But over the years, what happened was with the widespread availability of mobile phones, now the fan celebration in the cinema hall has become, first of all, contextualized. It's become a video, it starts circulating, and then over the period of time it lands up on YouTube. And today, it's professionally produced. There are people going around with cameras into cinema halls to make movies of what's happening inside cinema halls. So, this is an early one. This is from 2015. Notice all the blue dots you are seeing, all the white dots, they are mobile phones taking video of this. This is deputy chief minister, honorable deputy chief minister in his yeah. Yeah. So this is not a video. Some of you who are familiar with scholarship in film studies will aware of the name Anuja Mukherjee, Professor Jadavpur University. She had gone for the rerun of Dawn, the Hindi movie Dawn, Bachchan's Dawn, and this is a bunch of very particular Bengali, middle class men and women dancing to Main Hu Dawn song in a multiplex in Calcutta. Okay, so these are really people like us, or in fact people better placed than us. Yeah. So, yeah. 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 Okay. And then now this is another phenomenon. I think Professor Manu Chakravarti referred, in passing to these files and stories and so on. This is a video taken in I think Hyderabad or either Hyderabad or Bangalore. Soon after, in the theater, in the multiplex screening, screening Kashmir files. Okay? So what happens is that after the screening, there was slow reading and there was speech making happening. So this, now the reaction video is not a fan celebration so much as a theater becoming a kind of a political space, a very overused, very obvious political space. I think professionally produced, as you can see. So, yeah. So this is what had happened around Kashmir files. We saw this happening again with no, the latest one. No, Bengal. Yeah. So it was equipped, but the film didn't do so well, so it was considered. So now you see, a certain kind of cinema, a certain kind of cinema that becoming a site for, another kind of active viewership, an active viewership that is very explicitly directed political. not political because they are fans of Vijay who has entered politics or fans of Pawan Kalyan who has entered politics, not from the background, but directly political because they come in there dressed to protest and with the paraphernalia they will record them protesting and performing in the system. Okay. So if you think of the performing viewer and us as a students of this future, one of the things that we cannot deny is just as ChatGPT and other games of our life have been digitally enabled, the performance of viewership also has been digitally enabled. Okay, yeah, more. And now it is, of course, monetizable. It is very good to people trying to make a living through, through their social media channels or to amplifying various kinds of feeds that are given to them by political parties or politically exposed persons. Political mobilization is a big part of it, but so also commercial publicity, sales and so on is also now on social media and monetized. So you're no longer looking at an active viewer who is, resistant to industrial, to the industry or the commerce, but someone who is an active part of it, very much part of the publicity machine that all these, both media forms as well as political depend on. Yeah, and then what can, for us, as a student, I think it is back to the question of what is reading today and what to read. What to read as literature students do in a context where reading means all of this. Reading means performance, reading means not reading really, but actually latching onto something so it's almost like you're skimming and scanning and you find this paragraph as a professor and you're going to answer. Okay, so that is what reading might be. Yeah, yes. Okay, so given everything that is surrounded by, everything the one that I stopped here, one is really, I think that the core problem has not changed. It has not changed for us, it has not changed the cultural studies, the film studies. Basically, how do we read these new forms? And how do we teach students to read forms which you don't think cannot even exist in the classroom? So how do we teach forms that will emerge tomorrow? Okay, how do we teach reading forms that will emerge tomorrow? I haven't found the answer yet, but I hope it's an interesting enough question for us to stay with and do something with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Srinivas, for your presentation. I finally thank our technical team for turning on the presentation on digital turn when there was a glitch. On the contrary, I appreciate the sincerity of the presenter for expressing his ambiguity on the title of the topic. In fact, even I was a bit ambiguous about the title of the topic, and he's been very sincere enough. At the same time, I also appreciate his adventure to move further with the presentation, and I'm sure he's delivered justice. I expect all of you to give a big round of applause. Now, taking cue from the ambiguity, the shared ambiguity we both had, I would slightly realign the title as the actual title is Digital Turn, Decline of Readership and Viewership. If you ask me, I would slightly change this as Digital Turn, Migration of Readership and Viewership. I think migration would be most appropriate, which fits the theme of the presentation. He has spoken at length about the digital migration, about the digitextualization, so on and so forth. I will ponder on some of the points from the media students' perspective on this topic. What are the implications of this digital migration? Now, let me quote Berman Marshall, a very popular political scientist, political science theorist, who says, "You may not be interested in politics, but politics is certainly interested in you. And today we are discussing on the complications of the digital turn. I want all of you to replace politics as digital turn and rephrase the statement made by Burman Marshall. You may not be interested in digital media, but certainly digital media is interested in you. Let me also take you to the statement made by Robert Dahl, another political scientist, American. Wherever you may be, whatever you may be, you cannot be away from politics. Now, if you replace politics to digital turn, wherever you may be, whatever you may be, you cannot be away from the digital media. Now, if we go by what Professor Srinivas lamented in his presentation that, and if we agree that viewership is also leadership, I would like to discuss on some of the observations made by Madhusudan in the year 2009. Madhusudan in the 2009, he observes radio takes 40 years to reach 50 million homes. The radio, assuming the medium of readership equated as viewership, it took 40 years to reach 50 million homes. And television took 13 years to reach 15 million homes. And cable television took 10 years to reach 50 million homes. And the digital media took just 4 years to reach 50 million homes. Now you can imagine the kind of implication and the kind of content being generated here. Going by the statistics of the Statista.com, so far 29 zettabytes content is being generated, and remember, it is so far, assuming digital media had its genesis in the early 2000s, we are in the middle of the climax of the proliferation of the digital media. So far, that is up until 2022, the digital media generated 29 zettabytes. Remember, focus on the next statistics, and this 29 zettabytes is going to be doubled in the turn of 2026. What is being generated for almost 40 years up until 2022, and between 2022 and 2026, 29 zettabytes is going to be doubled. So you can imagine the kind of content, the volume of content we are accessing. Now, as of now, India is the country with the largest consumption of digital media. There are around 15 million users. Now, we are talking about the digital turn. Deciphering the phenomenon of digital turn, Marshall McLuhan identifies this digital turn as the fourth wave of communication. Media pundit, Canadian media pundit, who also gave the concept of medium is the message. He sees this digital turn as the fourth wave of communication. And this digital turn has brought the whole globe into one platform, and what he calls that as the platform of a global village. Today, with the convergent technology and with the incursion of the digital media, we are living in the global village. This is the fourth wave of communication. This is the fourth wave of digital turn. There are other three communication turns. The first turn being with the advent of print technology in the mid 14th century, what he also calls it as the Gutenberg effect. And the second turn, the advent of radio medium. The incursion of the radio medium to the masses is a very interesting story. When radio medium was introduced in the early 19th century, it did not came as a public tool. It did not come as a public tool. It did not come as a public welfare tool. It came as a tool of warmongering capitalists and warmongering authoritarianists. This medium was exploited maximum by Goebbels. Radio medium was first used as a tool of propaganda to launch the war of disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. It took almost 20 years for this radio medium to it almost took almost more than 20 years for this medium to migrate as a medium of welfare, as a welfare tool. Now, when this medium migrated as a welfare tool, Marshall McLuhan identifies this migration as this turn as now with the incursion of this radio medium as a public tool, there is an extension of the human ear. He says there is an extension of the human ear. Now the third turn is the invention of kaleidoscope and the invention of picture tube. Now with the invention of kaleidoscope and picture tube, Marshall McLuhan, he rephrases his earlier statement and he says, with the invention of these two media, there is an extension of the human ear and also there is an extension of the human eye. Now the fourth turn is the incursion of the digital medium, the digital turn, which we discussed earlier with the concept of global village. So in his presentation, Professor Srinivas spoke on the contextualization and he also brought some contradictory signs where 90% of the youth are literate, and he also mentioned about the Couple Park book reading clubs, and he also mentioned about the mediatization of the text, where he mentioned about the impact of social media, where he also spoke on the active viewing, and he also spoke about the disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation culminating in the fake news. Now, on behalf of everyone here, I once again thank Professor Srinivas for his presentation. Now the floor is open for the question and answer. ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳು ಏನಾದ್ರು ಇದ್ರೆ ಕೇಳ್ಬೋದು.
It is not a question per se. I was thinking, when you mentioned this innate IQ behavior that we carry in our institutional classes, derived largely from growth models. I was also thinking about the emergence of the data in case of India in the late 19th century, maybe, becoming various instruments of modern. But this reader, the emergence of the reader is also very interesting. Because just prior to that, I'm trying to connect the pre-modern and the current moment. Where, before reading, we had something called Parayana, right? So Parayana was also a kind of a performance where the critical thinking that we currently associate with, or the reflexivity that we associate with reading, was not maybe attributed to Parayana. So how do you read, I'm currently, and I'm not, it's not a question, but it's very interesting to look at these two foreigners in history and maybe create certain kinds of linkages. Because Parayana is performance, Parayana is devotion, Parayana has a certain absence maybe of the Vyasanic nature, that dynamics of, Ganapati interpreting the act of revenue, for example. All these somewhere are very curiously linked, very interestingly linked, and I'm trying to think through it. What would be your thoughts on this?
Going well beyond my areas of competence. But I think you yourself answered it when you said the performance could well be an interpretation. Right? Now, we have also, in terms of the, we understand also the text as something that is written. And indeed, texts have been written for thousands of years. But let's also not forget that the way in which people were mastering text till quite recently, till maybe a few hundred years ago, was to by heart. Now, is that, I mean, is let us say a recital of a text over the whole night, or the singing of hymns, is that a form of, engagement with the text, or is it simply something that people do mechanically? Right? But the minute you go into performance, it's clear. In every performance, in a way, is an interpretation of something that exists. Whether it was an oral text that was passed on, or whether it was, a written form that is being performed by the public. But yeah, interesting question. So in a sense that, we are not discovering any of these for the first time, except that I want to place the 21st century as a point of entry, not as a set of new and surprising findings, so much as some problems that now come into sharp focus when we suddenly, if you're asking questions of reading, then you suddenly realize that we haven't really even thought. Yes, people have written about reading cultures and about reader responses over the over history, and how do you assess how a book circulated and so on. But now we're coming into a much sharper focus once again, because of the fact that response is everywhere around us. Everybody is responding to, I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but everyone is responding to all kinds of texts and other people's responses too. But anyway, thank you for that. Yes. So good to keep in mind a long duty, sort of history of, or a long view of what's been happening.
So in that case, where are these audiences are going? Audience are used. What are they being? Would you say that busy with the smartphones or what?
They are no different from us. I mean, we have done every single thing except maybe go to the screen and dance. Again, I don't know, I can't speak for everybody here. We have done everything like this. We might have trolled someone, we might have responded, to a text with a 500-word Facebook post. We've done all of this. So why is it somebody else's problem, or somebody else's behavior?
Thank you, sir. This is not a question. I just wanted to add an interesting thing to what you showed today. And I hope that you showed the YouTube video where some non-Indians usually are choosing comparison. I just wanted to add how this monetize the professional produce display cycling on the Buddha scene. I from the document and I've done some study on. I've done some. I'm from the.
From the software development, I've done some study on this way they are represented. And one very interesting thing to note is the 19th century vision. In the mid 19th century, when we use this whole night-long ritual, so it is similar to what they are showing in this similar song. I quote, he says the most tedious hinge is what I heard. So from there to here, the transformation is quite remarkable.
Right.
And what you pointed out with all the leadership and how they have
And the other thing is, there was a kind of a pathological theme attached to the video that you showed on the machine.
So is it from a documentary or?
No, yeah. My guess is that it was a video that was acquired by a YouTube channel and sound was added, So, some of the sound is, actually, the sound is from the soundtrack of the film. Okay, now that's playing in the background. They might have, increased the volume. They've added some patches to a video that was probably shot by one of the viewers and it was sold to them or they found it somewhere and they started using it. They might be like this, some of them were made by professionals. You can see them interviewing, people and mics have brands and brand names on them. But this one doesn't seem to be produced by someone who was already there with a HD camera. It was possibly some because it's very disorganized and people are speaking now.
There was a tone, and there was a few, and he did convey something. Like maybe somebody on the other side is, other side of the ideology.
No, it's a sad, it's a pathos, not that was here. So it's evoking pathos, the sadness, so rather than, the main disease here. Some of it is opportunistic. There is money to be made, or there are people funding this kind of movie. This kind of movie might be promoted by a powerful minister, right? So there is, it's the flavor of the season, as it were. Some of it seems to be actively funded by people who have a political stake, and it's not about this party or that party. I've been very closely looking at political films made in Telugu. They're made by Telugu Desam Party, by YSRCP. They're sort of fighting with each other, making films. Really abusive, really conspiracy theory driven sort of films, accusing each other of murder and such like crimes. So it's not about just BJP versus Congress or some such thing. It's happening, where there is an access to the film industry or the media industry, it's happening there. So there is some very explicitly politically exposed cinema or media that's emerging. There is some opportunism. Now, if you talk about exploiting emotions, I mean, it is a job of writers to, evoke emotions. Now, at what point do we say this is exploitative and it is not? It depends on our political standpoint and our ethical standpoint. Now, and which is where, we can have a debate and so on. But I think the larger ecosystem is interesting. It's also sometimes scary, or very often more scary, but also interesting at times. And it's something that we cannot ignore anymore. That's all I'm trying to say. Even if you set aside all the funding issues and censorship issues and everything else that's happening around media in general and cinema in particular, there is also the viewing context, and that's what I think as literature students, that is one of the things that we should not miss. We should not, this is an opportunity. Like my title, there is clickbaiting, like you draw audience, promising them something, you don't give it to them. So once I have you in the hall, I can do what I want. But I need to have you in the hall, right? So there is an element of that, and I really think it's an opportunity. I'm not worried. I'm not even particularly pessimistic about the moment. I think the people who are most prepared to deal with this are literature teachers and students.
So the literature teachers separately, isn't it? So
We should be, yeah, absolutely.
You don't fall prey for clickbaiting.
Thanks, Srinivas, for that. I think it's a very important move that you're making in trying to remake what's reading and reading practices. By which I think you're also suggesting institutions don't keep pace with technology. But there is a certain kind of intelligibility which seems to work with technology, but that has not been enabled to speak the language of a discursive nature. So that seems to be the label that you're demanding.
Yes.
And how would you really think, what would be the design of that piece?
Yeah. Okay. I'm now only speaking only to Thirumal, okay? I'm saying, Thirumal, look at our age, okay? Look at the length of our careers, in the university, not very long. Okay, and we have come with a certain kind of training. Now the question we can ask ourselves is, what is our training, which had to do with, literally words on the page, somebody has a text on the, or on the board, and we talked about it. Okay? Now, what is it that moment, of course we have evolved with text. So what is it that training, some of which continues to be imparted in the classroom today, how does it move forward? Okay, how do we take it forward? And I think for us, the big challenge is, how do we, what sense can we make to students who are going to be dealing with tomorrow's text? We are not going to be there. We don't even know what kind of text they're going to read. As it is, we are discovering text because of our students, right? They are the ones who are saying, oh, have you seen this? Have you checked out this new form that's emerging, right? So I think that is the challenge. I think we really have to, take to it a certain kind of seriousness, not see it as a passing fad. It may be a passing fad, forms might come and go, but we keep asking ourselves, what kind of a text is it? Okay, and what kind of attention does it demand of me? What kind of an entity does it make of me? These are all 11 Research 101, English, sort of reader response theory 101 kind of questions. But the forms are new, and the platforms are new, right? And it's not very easy sometimes to figure out how these things even work. So I understand how limited our contribution can be, but it's interesting.
I just want to add one more thing. See, this is with regard to my own research in this area, where you began with standing fish.
Text in class, yeah.
In the class. Now, what I discovered was oftentimes many of these digital texts disappear. So there is a spectral text. The video is not available, but underneath there are all these comments, the new kind of comments being added, and the kind of debates that happen.
Yeah.
So different texts emerging without the source text being there.
Yeah.
The spectrality of the text, that is one thing. At another level, what is also very interesting, like what happened in Kerala recently, where a poem was described, apparently written by another, but later on it was discovered that it was just ChatGPT turning out the poem in the name of Kerala. So the question of authorship, for example, spectral text again, these all bring up various other kinds
and also the text out of context is not a new problem for us. That James Lawrence, David Chatterley's level, the whole discussion around how many pages is pornographic and how many pages is great art.
this is stuff that we've already known about, and it's except that it keeps coming back in interesting, spaces and interesting contexts. Of course, these are more immediate, these are more life and death kind of challenges. Banning the book, by James Lawrence really is not something that's very exciting for us today. But the fact is that texts are read like this, that you ban a book because it has those 3 pages or because it has something that upsets some authority somewhere. And here now the authority is very much, the people like us are very much now a part of that authority, part of that leader, which is censoriously reading.
So thank you for the insightful talk, sir. I wanted to ask, as you showed some clips of the public reactions of movies, not particularizing one, but you showed the Kantara. After those public reactions, there was a lot of controversy happening everywhere. So not only Kantara, many movies are getting these public reactions going on in Instagram, YouTube, and other medias. So after the controversy, many people who follow the culture started blaming the movie in itself. This happened especially with Kantara. So I think this was the public's fault because not necessarily did the movie's intention wasn't something to do like that. So what do you think? How blaming the movie, how much right is it?
I'm not blaming the movie. I'm not even blaming the public. See, on the one hand, there's great celebration of that movie, saying that it has brought certain cultural practices to light, and there's also the ownership of that movie by people who claim to be also following the same cultural practices, or at least have had some history. Okay, there is the movie. Mobile films gave a statement saying, please don't go into possession and don't start recreating the possession sequence. It's disrespectful of the practice and so on and so forth. Clearly, because there was a reaction to that. Some people like protested, they were demeaning the practice by sort of making it some kind of a show for people out there in the theater. But let's also not forget that every effort was made to locate the film, in a set of devotion practices. Okay, one of the early advertisements for the film said, okay, now we are entering the holy month, you should stop, you should not eat non-vegetarian food, you should do this, you should do that and do that. What we're trying to do, they're trying to say, okay, look, if you're not a fan of Chef Chetty, you can still come because it's actually a holy, it's part of some ritual practice and it's part of some, religious practice. Now, having done that, you can't quickly withdraw and say, hey, no, don't go into possession. It's not disrespectful. What are you trying to do? You're trying to create an immediate connection between that and a set of practices. The next step is possession. From the 1980s onwards, people have been going into trances in cinema halls after watching devotional films. Okay? Now, there are debates, there are discussions, there are criticisms of this practice in any number of Telugu magazines. Okay? Now, there were also accusations that these people were being paid to go into possession. Women were being paid so that they can pretend to go into possession so that more people come and watch the film. Okay? Now, so if you think of drama, then drama has a long history. This kind of drama has a long history. So this is really the kind of moment we are in where you invite participation, you encourage, you incite, invite participation, and of course there are moments when you can't control it. I'm not saying that's an act of resistance by people who are going into possession out there. I'm making no such argument which we all made in the 1990s cultural studies movement. But I'm just saying that now all of us in different ways and to different degrees are being invited to do something similar, even if it is just to click the heart button, even if it is just to retweet. It's an invitation to participate, and the technology comes with that. It's technologically enabled, and sometimes it also results in offline actions. Offline actions can include riotous kind of actions, violent actions. It can result in very, very loud sort of performances,
In North America, people have taken Telugu films off theaters because of the behavior of audiences. Okay? And they were making videos of celebrations in the cinema halls, and North American distributors said, we can handle this. Okay, so it has even commercial consequences, right? So that is, if you like, the given. And all of these are symptoms of that, of the given. So, who's right? Is the public right? Is the public wrong? Everybody is part of the same story.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. It was truly an interesting session. There were many issues that were debatable issues. In fact, we both of us discussed before choosing this topic. We had one-to-one conversation on this. Thank you for sticking on to the same topic, and I do believe it's a burning issue, burning topic, very much a burning topic. And the thing is, like, we have to felicitate Srinivas, who has come all the way from Bangalore. I call upon the stage Professor Manu Chakravarti. Sir, please come on the stage to felicitate Professor Srinivas. I request Mr. Vijay Sheshambi to come on the stage and felicitate the session chair, Professor, Associate Professor, my colleague, my friend, Shailesh Rajaras. Thank you, sir. I call upon my colleague, Sidhe Gowda, who is also a director of studio, our studio, Ksou studio, who happens to be a director. He has directed six cinemas, and please come on the stage. Sidhe Gowda, in opinion, as a director, please. He wants to share his experience as a director.
ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳ್ಬೋದಾ? ಓಕೆ. ನನಗೆ ತುಂಬಾ ಖುಷಿಯಾಗಿತ್ತು ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ಬೆಳಗ್ಗೆಯಿಂದ ನಾನು ಈ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮದಲ್ಲಿ ಓಡಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ, ತೊಡಗಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೀನಿ. ಕಾರಣ ಯಾಕೆಂದ್ರೆ ಇದು ನನ್ನ ವೃತ್ತಿಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಂತ ಒಂದು ವಿಚಾರ ಸಂಕಿರಣ. ಬಟ್ ಈ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಸಿನಿಮಾ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ನನ್ನ ಅನುಭವದಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳೋದಾದ್ರೆ ಒಂದಕ್ಕೆ ಒಂದು ಸಂಬಂಧನೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಇವತ್ತಿನ ಕಾಲಘಟ್ಟದಲ್ಲಿ ಸಿನಿಮಾದ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಬೇರೆ ಇದೆ, ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ ಇದೇ ಬೇರೆ. ನನ್ನ ಅನುಭವದಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ಈಗ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ, ಈಗ ಕಾಂತಾರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೆ. ಕರ್ನಾಟಕನ ಇವತ್ತು ಔಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಕಂಟ್ರಿ ಹೇಗೆ ನೋಡ್ತಾರೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ,
ಒಂದು ಕಾಂತಾರ ಸಿನಿಮಾವನ್ನ ಗುರಿಯಾಗಿ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ನೋಡ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅದು ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಬೇರೆ ಇದೆ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಾದೇಶಿಕ ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಅನ್ನು ಒಳಗೊಂಡಿದೆ, ಇಡೀ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಅನ್ನ ಒಳಗೊಂಡಿಲ್ಲ. ಆದ್ರಿಂದ ಈ ಸಂವಿಧಾನದ ಬಹಳ ಅತ್ಯುತ್ತಮವಾಗಿ ಕಾಣ್ತದೆ. ಯಾಕೆಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಈ ಕಡೆ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಸಿನಿಮಾನ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಯಾರು ಗೊತ್ತಿದೆಯೋ ಅವ್ರು ಯಾರು ಸಿನಿಮಾಗೆ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಸಿನಿಮಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾರು ತೊಡಸ್ಕೊತಾನೆ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಸಿನಿಮಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಟೆಕ್ನಿಕಲ್ ಆಗಿ ಗೊತ್ತಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಪರ್ಸನ್ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಗೊತ್ತಿರಲ್ಲ. ಆ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಗೊತ್ತಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು ಆ ಟೆಕ್ನಿಕಲ್ ಪರ್ಸನ್ ಜೊತೆ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡುವ ನಿಟ್ಟು ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಬೇಸರ ತರುತ್ತೆ. ಅವರು ಯಾವತ್ತೂ PhD ಮಾಡಿದಂಥವ್ರು ದೊಡ್ಡ ದೊಡ್ಡ ವಿಷಯ ತಜ್ಞರಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವಲ್ ಬರ್ದಿರೋದು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹಿಂದೆ ನೋಡ್ಕೊಂಡ್ಬಿಡ್ತಾರೆ, ಅವ್ರು ಬರೋದೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ನಾವು ಸಿನಿಮಾ ತೆಗೆದು ಒಂದೇ ಹೇಳ್ತಿದೀವಿ, ಅದನ್ನೇ ಆ ಟೆಕ್ನಿಕ್ ಆ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ವೇ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಲ್ಲಿ. ನಾವು ಸಿನಿಮಾ ತೆಗೆದು ಒಂದು ಕಥೆಯನ್ನ ಆಧಾರವಾಗಿ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಒಂದು ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿ ಸಂಪ್ರದಾಯ ಆಚಾರ ವಿಚಾರ ಇದೆಲ್ಲವನ್ನ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಬರೆಯುವಂಥದ್ದು ಒಂದು ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಲ್ವಾ? ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಅಂತ ಏನು ಕರಿತೀವಿ ಸರ್? ನಾವು ಒಂದು ಹೂವಿನ ಹಾರ ಅಂತ ಒಂದು ಸಿನಿಮಾವನ್ನ ಮಾಡಿದೆ. ಒಂದಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವುದೇ ನಾಯಕ ನಾಯಕಿ ಯಾವ ಸಿನಿಮಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಒಂದು ಹೂವಿನ ಹಾರ, ಒಂದು ಗ್ರ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಆಗಿ ಒಂದು ಹೂವಿನ ಹಾರ. ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟಿಂಗು ಒಂದು ಮಾರ್ಕೆಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಸಿಗುತ್ತೆ, ಯಾರು ಸತ್ತೋಗಿರ್ತಾರೆ, ಡೆತ್ ಆಗಿರ್ತಾರೆ, ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಹೂವನ್ನ ಪರ್ಚೇಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನೆ, ತಕೊಂಡೋಗೋದ್ರೊಳಗಡೆ ಅದನ್ನ ಬಾಡಿ ಸುತ್ತ ಹಾಕಿರ್ತಾನೆ. ಈ ಹೂವಿನ ಹಾರ ಒಬ್ಬ MLA ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಅದೇ ಹೂವಿನ ಹಾರ MLA ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಜಗಳ ಆಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ದೇವಸ್ಥಾನಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ, ದೇವಸ್ಥಾನದಿಂದ ಒಂದು ಮದುವೆ ಮನೆಗೆ ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ. 2 ಹೂವಿನ ಹಾರ ಅದು ಮದುವೆ ಆಗ್ಬೇಕು. ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಹಾಗೆ ಅದು ತನ್ನ ಕಥೆಯನ್ನ ಸುತ್ಕೊಂಡು ಕೊನೆಗಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಈ ದೇಶವನ್ನ ಕೈವಂತ ಒಬ್ಬ ಯೋಧನಿಗೆ ಮತ್ತೆ ಈ ರೈತ ಆತ್ಮಹತ್ಯೆ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಾನೆ ಅವನಿಗೆ ಅವರಿಬ್ಬರ ಡೆಡ್ ಬಾಡಿ ತಗೊಂಡೋಗ್ಬಿಡುತ್ತೆ. ಇದು ನನ್ನ ಹೂವಿನ ಹಾರದ ಕಾನ್ಸೆಪ್ಟ್. ಯು ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ಅಂಡರ್ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡ್. ಅದರಿಂದ ನನಗೆ ತುಂಬಾ ಕಾರವಾಗಿದ್ದು ಇದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಇನ್ನೂ ತುಂಬಾ ದೀರ್ಘವಾಗಿ ಅಧ್ಯಯನ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ. ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಸಿನಿಮಾ ಅಂಡ್ ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ದೀರ್ಘವಾಗಿ ಅಧ್ಯಯನ ಮಾಡಿ ಆದಷ್ಟು ಯಾರ್ಯಾರು ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಗೊತ್ತಿದೆ ಅವರೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಸಿನಿಮಾಕ್ಕೆ ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ಬನ್ನಿ. ಯಾಕೆಂದ್ರೆ ಸಿನಿಮಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ನ ಕಥೆಗಾರರ ಕೊರತೆ ಇದೆ, ಬರವಣಿಗೆ ಕೊರತೆ ಇದೆ. ಬರವಣಿಗೆ ಕೊರತೆ ಇರೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಟುಡೇ ಸಿನಿಮಾ ಸಾಯ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಬರವಣಿಗೆ ಬ್ಯೂಟಿಫುಲ್ ಆಗಿದ್ದಾಗ ಸಿನಿಮಾ ಸಾಯದೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಸಿನಿಮಾ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್ ಬ್ಯೂಟಿಫುಲ್ ಆಗಿ ಯಾರು ಬರವಣಿಗೆಯಾಗಿ ಬರೀತಾರೋ, ಸಿನಿಮಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಅಳವಡಿಸ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾರೋ ಆ ಸಿನಿಮಾ ಎಲ್ಲ ಗೆದ್ದಿದೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಇನ್ನೂ ತುಂಬಾ ಇದೆ. ಬಟ್ ಟೈಮ್ ಆಗಿರೋದ್ರಿಂದ ನಾನು ಮಾತಾಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ಸರ್.
Thank you. That is it for today. We meet again tomorrow at 10:30. Okay. And for the people presenters who have come from other parts of India, the dinner will arrive at 8:30 at the guest house, dining hall. Please assemble at 8:30.